open up to Philippians chapter 4 if you want to, and we'll start out there in just a minute. But tonight we are addressing a certain topic that we've looked at a little bit before, but also that is worth looking at again from a different angle. And the topic, at least as a whole, is that of anxiety, specifically differentiating what the Bible talks about with anxiety from what we mean sometimes when we talk about that word. And so we'll try to examine that as we go through. Aside from dealing with the topic at hand, this lesson also should do a pretty good job at helping us to see that sometimes when we're looking at the Bible, just because we recognize the word that's written on the page, that doesn't necessarily mean that it means exactly what we think it means. Let me give you a couple of examples of that before we get into the one that we're going to look at tonight. In the Bible, it's referenced over 100 times, closer to a couple hundred times, I believe, the name Isaac. And so if I were to go into the text of the Bible and assume that every time it used the word Isaac, it meant Isaac Hall, would I have a good understanding of the Bible? Probably not. I don't get to take what I understand and put it into the text. It's not how it works. Another example would be, again, this is an extreme example, but if you were reading the book of Revelation and you get to the church at Philadelphia and you assume that it means one in Pennsylvania, then you don't understand the text. But what you've done is you've taken your understanding of a word as it exists today and you forced it back into what it should have meant at the time it was written in Scripture. And so we're going to take a look at the broader concept of anxiety, of course, but that idea will come up, that not every meaning has application within the text of Scripture. And so, with this word anxiety in particular, how does the Bible use it? That's the question. And so we'll take a little look at a few of the passages in which it's most prominently used. But just to start with, at least in the New King James translation of the Bible, it's used 8 times. Anxiety or anxious is how it's used most often. And that's not a whole lot of times, but at the same time, there are a lot of other terms that are used that, as far as the Bible terms anxiety, are probably synonymous. Words like troubled or disturbed or distressed are often going to mean something along the lines of the biblical meaning for anxiety. And so if someone is troubled or they're distressed, you see that a lot in the Psalms, for example, with David's Psalms. And that may mean the same thing that we're talking about there. But when people bring up anxiety, or sometimes you'll just call it worry, usually there's a few passages you would go to. The 2 biggest ones you could probably guess. One of them was already read for us in Philippians chapter 4. So in this text, as we said, it's well known for that. And it's especially well known because it gives what looks like a command in verse 6 there. Be anxious for nothing. And generally people take that and they say, okay, then you should not be anxious for anything. That is a great idea. Has that ever worked out for you? I don't think so. And so instead what this text appears to do is to say, don't be anxious, but instead try to do this. And so the instead is offer prayer, and then also, when we get to verse 8 later, to meditate on certain things. And so it's offering a potential way out, or something that can be useful to get yourself away from anxiety, more so than it is just strictly commanding, don't be anxious ever, or you're sinning. That's not a good understanding there. The other passage that we would probably turn to if we're going to talk about anxiety, or more specifically worry, would be in Matthew chapter 6. And so starting in verse 25 there and following, there's a little dialogue that Jesus gives right in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, talking about worry. And he says, do not worry. So again, like this, do not be anxious, do not worry about anything really, about your food or your clothes or about tomorrow. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. So is that a command to say, do not worry, or it is a sin? Well, that would be another poor understanding of it. But as for right now, all we need to know about it is that it emphasizes God's ability to take care of his own people. And it certainly does do that when you go through the passage. It also emphasizes our inability, our helplessness when it comes to changing anything in our life, significantly especially. One more passage we might add to this mix, though, is 1 Peter chapter 5. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7, there's another use of anxious there. I'll turn over there real quick. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7 says, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. So the term care is used here. So we've actually used three different words that are all kind of describing the same idea. We've used anxious, we've used in Matthew 6, we've used worry, and then here in 1 Peter, we have used care. And so all of these can be similar enough ideas, and biblically speaking, they do often get used for that. But here in 1 Peter, it seems to be offering another solution for worry. And the solution this time is the same as was offered in Philippians, which is pray. Okay, good. So we'll add that to our list. Now the question becomes, what do we do with verses like this, especially when talking about worry or anxiety? Well, the typical usage of these passages, the typical application of these passages is something to the effect of, don't worry, instead pray. Okay, that's valid enough. It is kind of in the text. Or it'll be, don't be anxious, just have more faith that God will take care of you. And then that will solve the problem, whatever that problem may be. Or whatever other thing somebody might say, again, pray about it, or count your blessings, or do something spiritual to remedy the problem that you're in. Okay, that would be the typical understanding. Now, we've looked at the passages, we've looked at the typical application of those passages, but biblically speaking, what is anxiety as it's used in Scripture? Well, it depends on the text that you're looking at, but for example, in 1 Peter, the text that we looked at, where it says casting your care upon him. The word for care, from the original language that gets used there, means to be drawn in different directions. So in its most literal sense, the word means to draw in different directions. Now, if you've ever felt any kind of anxiety, you understand that that is an accurate description of what it feels like to be in that situation. But the root that it comes from, and probably the meaning more generally, is to be divided. And so you could even say that it means to distract. And certainly that would be an application as well. And certainly anxiety has the ability to distract or to divide, separate one's attention. But it means to be drawn apart. And going beyond just the way that it's used in that passage, I'll read from the Baker's Bible Dictionary, which is what it sounds like. It's one of those standard Bible dictionaries that you can find. In defining how the New Testament uses this term, it says this about anxiety. It says, anxiety frequently manifests itself in ungodly concern about provision, performance, or reputation, and appears to be rooted in an incomplete knowledge or failure to take an eternal perspective on things. And I think, given the passages that we looked at, that's a pretty fair definition of how the Bible intends the word anxiety to be understood. And so what it intends to be understood as is anxiety or worry that has been caused by the circumstances that you're in, and the appropriate response being either to learn more, or the appropriate response being to focus more on the eternal. Again, given those three passages that we looked at, that's a pretty accurate understanding of the biblical meaning of anxiety. And so when we talk about biblical anxiety or worry or care, it's generally going to be a temporary feeling that is based on the situation that someone finds themselves in, whether that be from physical things that are happening or spiritual stressors that are going on. When those things enter, then it causes this feeling, and it results in anxiety. Now, just stopping there for a second, we'll wrap all of this up by saying that anxiety or worry in the biblical sense is not a sinful behavior that happens. And we kind of already alluded to that. But one way we can mention that farther, so the same word that's used in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7, casting your care on him, is also used by Paul of himself in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 28. In that text, Paul is giving a list of all the bad and awful things that have happened to him. And so he says that he's been shipwrecked and he's been beaten half to death and he's been all of these awful things for the sake of Christ. And he says at the end of that list, and besides all of these things is his care for all the churches that weighs on him daily. Okay? So he says, using that same word of care, which we would understand to be the same as anxiety, he says, besides all the physical problems that I have going on, there's also the mental strain and the spiritual stress of praying for, of being concerned about the things that are happening in all the churches that I'm associated with. And so that's not necessarily a problem by itself, but it can become a problem because, as we saw, the root of the word for anxiety means to be distracted. It means to be torn into different directions. And so we wouldn't desire that for anyone. But we'll step aside from that understanding, and we'll take a little bit of a deep dive, hopefully not too deep, hopefully we can recover our way out of it, into the modern understanding of anxiety. And so there is a difference between what the Bible is using or meaning when it uses the word and what we might use today or mean today when we use the word anxiety. So a couple ways we can take this. The first one will be very brief, which is that you could mean it in general. Now, if I say today that I am anxious about something, what does that mean? It means pretty much the same as what it meant in the Bible. It means that there are some stressors that are happening that I'm concerned about, and maybe I lose sleep over, or maybe it's causing other problems, but it's just general. It's not that there's some specific thing or unspecific thing, as we'll talk about in just a second, that's going on, but instead, I mean it pretty much the way of the Bible. But there's another way that we use anxiety today that would differ quite a bit from the way that the Bible uses it. And that would be in any kind of clinical, any kind of psychological way. When we say anxiety as in an anxiety disorder, we are talking about something, this is my argument I suppose, we're talking about something that is not meant in the text of Philippians chapter 4 and verse 6. That there is a real difference between what the Bible writers intended when they said anxious and what we mean today as we've defined a certain kind of psychological disorder as it happens and as it's observed today. Okay, so with that, let's take a brief look at, for the sake of understanding better and understanding the difference, let's take a brief look at the psychological category of anxiety disorders. Real quick. There are 5 different anxiety disorders that are all grouped together. And some of them aren't that surprising, and some of them you might not know fit into this category as far as psychologists are concerned. But let's go through them again quite quickly. Number 1 is generalized anxiety disorder, or it's said, or it's shortened to GAD sometimes as it forms that acronym. But it is characterized by chronic, as in repeated, heightened states of anxiety or of undue stress or worry or tension, and it's not otherwise specified as one of these other disorders. And you'll see that a lot whenever you're in psychology as far as what is considered the base level of something. Most of the time it's just, well, this is what it is, and we can't really pin it down to something more specific. So it's generalized, and that's why it's called that. The second one is panic disorder, which is very much like generalized anxiety disorder, except that it's characterized by more panic attacks, and that's the primary difference between them. A panic attack, if you've never had one, is characterized by feelings of tightness in one's chest, sometimes even feels like a heart attack. Shortness of breath often happens alongside it, as well as dizziness and chest pain in general. So all of those things come together. Panic attacks often happen in generalized anxiety disorder, but they'll happen more prevalently, and they'll be the primary presenting feature in panic disorder. And those ones, I think, are the more recognized, or at least generalized anxiety disorder is. And if somebody says that they have anxiety, that's probably what they mean, is that they have generalized anxiety disorder. The other 3 on this list, though, we probably don't associate so much with anxiety, but they share some common characteristics with it, and so that's why they're part of the same group. So the third one that we would mention, and before I mention these, let yourself ask the question to yourself, do you view the latter part of this list differently than the first? And if so, why? But the second part of this list is PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder. That's considered an anxiety disorder. It is almost always caused by a trauma that precedes the other events taking place. It's usually associated with certain triggers, as in certain things, certain sounds or sights will spur on an episode of anxiety. And so you have this recurring intense anxiety that happens at certain points. The fourth one is social anxiety, which you may or may not be familiar with. Social anxiety, though, is, if it's general, then it means that you are not capable of going out in public, maybe at all, or at least in a very limited way, without being under crippling anxiety. It could also be more specific than that. It could be situational, and so it could be that you can go out in public just fine, but if you have to get up in front of a group of people at all, you cannot do it. And so there is a difference between being afraid of public speaking and social anxiety, but it could be that. Or a different situational form of this anxiety stems from eating. So some people are not able to eat in front of others. They can do anything else. But when it comes to that, it's just not a possibility. And then the last one that we would mention, and again, this one doesn't seem to fit the mold, but it's OCD. And so obsessive compulsive disorder. Obsessive compulsive disorder is kind of what it sounds like if you break it down, but it means that you have obsessions, it means you fixate on certain things. It means that you have compulsions, which means that you do certain things almost beyond your control. And usually these things will fixate on cleaning, on checking, on counting, on different things that are specific to the individual. But these rituals, these routines have to be done in order to provide some form of temporary relief, or anxiety builds and builds. And so that's why it's part of this group as well. But with all five of these things, let's emphasize first that none of these are chosen by an individual. Nobody wakes up one morning and thinks, this sounds like fun, because it's not. None of these things are beneficial to experience, and all of them cause some kind of trouble within somebody's life. But the primary reason all these are linked together, the primary symptoms of anxiety disorders are the same. And so what is the underlying similarity here? In all of these cases, there are several adjectives here, intrusive and often unrealistic anxiety surrounding something. And so intrusive, meaning that you don't want them to be there, you don't want this feeling to be there, but it's there anyway. Unrealistic, of course, being that it doesn't really make sense, or instead of unrealistic, it could be entirely baseless or even unidentifiable. It could be that you are anxious, but you don't know what the cause is. And so with all of these things, and with this basic understanding, the question is, does this understanding of anxiety mirror what the Bible talks about directly when it mentions anxiety? And what we have to say is there are two different meanings. There are two different understandings of this same word. Just the same as we would say that Philadelphia, Pennsylvania does not fit the understanding of the Bible's use of Philadelphia in the region of Turkey today. Those aren't the same. And so the same thing is true here. The difference being that biblical anxiety or biblical worrying is generally focused on something that has actually happened and has real-world spiritual solutions, whereas the anxiety that we're talking about in the modern psychological sense does not necessarily stem from any real-world issue that's happening. Not to say that real-world stressors cannot have an effect on those with anxiety. They certainly do, and any of those stressors can add to or amplify the symptoms that are being experienced. But there is that basic difference. And so, as quick as we can, because we don't want to dwell on this forever, what is the appropriate response to anxiety in general, let's say? That would depend on if we are talking about anxiety as the Bible has defined it, or anxiety as we have defined it in psychological terms. And so if we can establish any kind of difference, then we would need to treat them perhaps differently from one another. And we'll go into that more as we talk. But first, let's answer this question real quick. What causes anxiety, psychologically speaking? Well, this is a gross oversimplification of it. But, generally speaking, anxiety disorders, or most other disorders of any kind, are either psychologically based, which means it could be from a trauma that has happened, it could be from a history of abuse, it could be from illness, it could be from substance abuse, it could be from any number of things. But it could be that it's strictly psychological, it could be more on the physiological side. It's not very well understood as far as what happens in one's brain to cause certain things and in other brains cause something else. And so we could boil it down to brain chemistry, but again, that's way oversimplifying. And the third thing would be genetics. And it could be, in a lot of cases at least, it seems to be that genetics play a factor in anxiety. And so you'll see that run within families, or again, we're not just talking about generalized anxiety, but even some of these other things like OCD or social anxiety. Now, before we make this sound too separate, let's talk about the way in which anxiety disorders are treated from a strictly secular, strictly psychological perspective. Because it may be that even though we're saying that these two things are separate and they are different, that the treatment might not be that different from what the Bible has to say on the subject. And so a few things that we could look at as far as modern therapies and modern techniques that are used in dealing with anxiety. One thing would be avoiding triggers. Now, that sounds pretty simple, and it is pretty simple, but especially if you have PTSD, for example, and you have certain triggers that will bring you back to this heightened state of anxiety, then what's one of the simplest things you can do? Try to avoid those triggers. And biblically speaking, we see kind of the same thing, even in a spiritual sense. For example, we looked at 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7. If you go to the next verse, another well-known verse right next to it, it says, "Be sober, be vigilant, for your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour." Okay, what's the solution? Well, avoid him. Avoid the trigger. And we would say the same thing even for temptation, for sin. We would say if you want to try to not sin, well, maybe you need to avoid whatever triggers you to that sin. Not all that different. Second thing we could look at is reframing. Reframing is kind of what it sounds like, but it's saying if you think about something one way, you're going to be taught to think about it in a different way, or from a different perspective even. Well, if we go back to Matthew chapter 6 that we were talking about, starting in verse 25 and following, what does Jesus say after he says, "Do not worry"? He says, "Do not worry." Why? Well, just take a look at the birds of the field, and take a look at the lilies that grow. Do they worry? Maybe if you reframe your thinking, and instead you take the perspective of the birds of the field and say, well, if God cares for them, then maybe, just maybe, God will take care of me too. So a similar technique, again, from the Bible's perspective, or from the perspective of psychological treatment. A third thing that's very frequently taught is to learn and to gain coping skills. And so if you can't avoid the problem altogether, you need to learn techniques to try to deal with it when it happens. Okay, what is usually high among the list of coping skills that are taught for anxiety or for any other number of issues going on? Meditation would be near the top of the list. And we go back to Philippians chapter 4 and verse 8. And we'll read the text again because it's worth reading. "Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there's any virtue, if there's anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things." And so again, maybe, just maybe, even if these are separate ideas, and even if we mean different things when we say the same word of anxiety, some of the treatments at least will overlap. Because there is enough similarity there that certainly we don't have to separate this entirely and say that there is only a spiritual side or only a physical side. Now, that being said, there's another complication that comes up when we take our understanding of anxiety and we force it back into the text of the Bible. Oftentimes, it has happened that people have been diagnosed, psychologically speaking, with some form of anxiety or with some other issue for that matter. But the response from well-meaning Christians is that they just need to have more faith, they just need to pray, and that will be enough. Should those things be abandoned? God forbid. Those things need to be continued. Prayer has to happen alongside this. And having faith has to happen alongside this. But oftentimes that recommendation is made to the exclusion of cognitive behavioral therapy or of medication or any other kind of treatment. And so the question is, if we can look at the causes of these issues and we can identify that they are not purely spiritual causes, then should our response be purely spiritual? Not purely. Why? Because there are other things that could be beneficial as well. And so let's take medication as the example. Again, with medication, if psychological disorders are medically caused, at least in part, then should our response be perfectly spiritual? Well, I know it's an old argument, but let's go ahead with it and ask, would you make the same recommendation for somebody that has diabetes as you would for someone that has anxiety? Would you say, pray about it, have faith, don't take the insulin, and God will take care of you? Is that a good recommendation? Is that a healthy recommendation? Is that going to see them improve at all? Only if God chooses to heal them miraculously, apart from any intervention that man has, through the grace of God, come up with. And so we can't really separate treatment in the form of medication from the psychological issue that's going on. Now, a second concern that people have sometimes with medication is that of addiction. And so a lot of people don't want to be on a medication that they feel that they need to be themselves or they need to take on a regular basis. And so the question is it addiction to take medication? Well, let's start again with what we've already mentioned, which is that if you don't take diabetes, or if you don't take insulin for your diabetes, you're going to run into trouble. And if you need that to feel like yourself, or if you need that to be healthy, then it would be a poor decision to stop that treatment. But on the other hand, with addiction, we would say that addiction is not needing medication to feel okay. There is a difference. Addiction is not taking medication as prescribed. That may be one of the biggest differences. There is no one who is addicted to medicine of any kind that takes the medicine as their doctor told them to. That's not how addictions work. There always has to be an element of dependence there and of abuse. And addiction is a cycle of abuse, of misuse, of whatever the medication is, or at least self-dosing of that medication. The other thing with anxiety in particular, I know this is getting almost off the deep end here, but the other issue with anxiety medication as far as addiction is concerned is that there is a low danger of addiction. Why? Well, because medicines like Lexapro, medicines like Paxil, medicines like Buspar, they do not have the same effect as something like a painkiller does. They do not have a euphoric effect. And so when you see on the medicine that says not habit forming, that's what it means. It means it won't give you any kind of high. If there's no kind of high, you're not at a high risk of getting addicted to the substance. Along with that, these substances, these antidepressants, or what's almost always used to treat anxiety, are not regulated by the government. They're not on any of the schedules. They're not a controlled substance. And again, why is that? Well, because they're not habit forming. And then also, the dosages that are given of these medicines are incredibly low compared to something like a painkiller. And so you're not really running that risk. So all that just to say that shouldn't be a concern. But the third thing, this goes back to 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8. The verse there, again, talking about the devil walking about like a roaring lion, it starts by saying, be sober and be vigilant. But it says, be sober. Well, it doesn't really mean don't drink. It's not really the understanding of that verse, although if you drink enough, obviously you would not be sober enough to put off the temptations of the devil, so that could apply. But instead, what it means to be sober, or to be sober-minded, as some translations put it, It means to, literally, the word as it was used in the original language, means to be calm, or it means to be collected in spirit. I kind of like that understanding, because we already said that the word in the previous verse for care means to be divided in spirit. It means to be drawn apart in spirit. And so in the next verse, God says what? He says, don't be that. He says, be collected in spirit. Don't be divided. Don't be distracted. Now the question is, for you, if this were to apply to you, or if you're trying to help someone that this applies to directly, the question is, can you be collected in spirit without being on medication? Can you be collected in spirit without being in some kind of ongoing counseling or therapy? If the answer is no, you might not be able to fulfill this obligation to be sober so that you can watch out for the devil and all the things that he is trying to do. So with all of this, the question will be, how do we respond? Because there are people who are suffering with anxiety. And if you don't know anyone who's suffering with anxiety, then you just haven't talked too much to anybody, or you haven't listened too much to anybody, because they are there. And even in this church, if you think that you know one or two people with anxiety, you don't know a fifth of the people with anxiety. In just this church, there are plenty of people that deal with all of these things that we listed before. And so the question is, how will we respond? The options are these. Back in the book of Job, in Job chapter 3, shortly after Job has experienced the loss of everything in his life, and his life has crumbled before him, he says this. In verse 25 of Job chapter 3, he says, "For the thing I greatly feared, or was anxious about, has come upon me, and what I dreaded has happened to me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, for trouble comes." If you were to describe anxiety and the feeling that someone gets in, and the state that they're in, this would probably be a pretty good way to do it. And so the question is, how do we respond when we find someone in this situation? And again, the choices are pretty easy. The one choice is to be Job's friends. Does anybody want to have that put on their tombstone? I was like one of Job's friends. Is that a glowing review of your life? Probably not. But as his life was in this state, and he's under all this pressure, Job's friends do what? They say, well, Job, if you had more faith in God, this wouldn't happen. They say, Job, if you would just pray to God, then he would get you out of this situation without any other help. Well, Job, if you hadn't have done all of these things wrong in your life, then God wouldn't be doing this to you. Is that how we want to act toward those who are in need of our help? The statement is made famously, and you know the statement in Romans chapter 12 and verse 15. It says, "Rejoice with those who rejoice." And the second half of that says to weep with those who weep. And so it may not be enough for us to look at the people who weep and tell them to rejoice. It may not be enough for us to take that approach, but maybe it will be enough to weep with those who weep and to get help for those who need help. And so what do we do with all of this? Well, number one, we don't automatically assume that just because we understand what this word means in one context, that it will always mean that in every context. Because it doesn't work that way, and it certainly doesn't work that way in every verse of the Bible. And right along with that, we make sure that we aren't guilty of misusing texts of the Bible to avoid helping people who are in need. Now, this is a twofold problem, and so I want to apologize if at any point in this lesson I've made it seem that this should only be responded to in a physical way, because it cannot be physical by itself. Instead, it is a twofold problem. It is a physical problem, but it's also a spiritual problem. And so there are these two sides to this, and if we look at it from both sides, then we would do the same as we would do with any other illness that we happen to have. We would certainly ask and receive treatment, because that's what you should do, and we would also pray about it, because that's what you should do as well. And so should someone in this situation have more faith? Well, who doesn't need more faith? Should someone in this situation pray? Well, who shouldn't be praying for everything that's going on in their life? But again, that by itself isn't going to be the full response that's needed. The other statements that we'll make are these. How effective is someone for the kingdom of God? How effective is someone for Christ when they don't feel like themselves? If they aren't capable of being sober-minded, if they aren't capable of acting like themselves, then how effective can they be as a servant of God? And we'll make this statement as well, perhaps the strongest statement we can make here, that Satan is, and Satan will continue to use well-meaning Christians who are even using verses from the Bible, and he will use them to help gain himself more souls. Now, how does that work? All Satan has to do is convince enough people that they need to teach others that they cannot respond to something in a physical way or in a medical way or in a psychological way that needs that kind of treatment, and he's already won those souls over. And so the question, of course, for us will be, will we continue to let our brothers and sisters, will we continue to let other Christians or even people who aren't Christians that might need the help suffer in a situation where there is hope, or will we let them draw themselves farther and farther away from God and farther away from His church? This evening, obviously, if this lesson does apply to you directly and you need direct assistance from the church, this is the time. But aside from that, tonight, hopefully this has been a helpful lesson in understanding that sometimes things don't mean exactly what we think, and we need to take a step back and make sure that our understanding lines up with how the Bible uses a term, not just with what we think about a term. And then also, of course, if tonight you are not a child of God, tonight if you have never put Him on in baptism, this is your opportunity. Tonight, if there's any need that you have, whether it be prayers or whether it be anything else, we ask that you come forward now as we stand, as we sing.